Good morning, everyone. We will get started in just a minute or two, if you could find a seat. A word to those of you in the know. There are certain places in the sanctuary that are better for hearing than others. And there are certain places in the sanctuary where we have speakers, and they are on the pillars halfway back. Those are really good places to sit if you're in a dead zone. Right. Yeah. Are you on?
I think I'm on. Am I on? Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So Paul and I will have a little Q&A together, and then we'll open it up to the congregation. Phil Bolander is walking around somewhere. He has a handheld mic. There he is right here. And he will, so raise your hand when you have a question, and he will come over and put it right up to your mouth, because that's what you need to do to be heard. Right?
Yes.
So Paul, thanks so much for your great sermon this morning. And, I apologize for the lengthy intro, but I was really trying to make you sound good. So anyway, could you talk a little bit about, I think what the lingo around Christian nationalism is confusing. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between nationalism and patriotism?
Well, I view myself as a patriot. I come from a long family of people who were fortunate in this family.
Yeah, make sure your mic's on.
My mic is on, but my little thing.
There we go.
You know what? I think my head is too big. I have too big of a head. Does that help if I just stick it right here?
Right.
Okay, I'm going to do that.
And they just turned you up too.
Okay, everybody. So I come from a family that strongly believed in this country and dedicated a lot of, they were the kinds of people who invested in this country because they believed in the promise of it. Imperfect, but with the promise of getting better. And so I proudly claim myself to be a patriot because I believe in the promise of this country to live up to ideals that it says it has and that often it displays. Nationalism is a role that has with it a kind of authoritarianism and an insistent. Generally, nationalism means that the United States has a privileged status, and often Christian nationalists will say it has a privileged status because it is a Christian nation, and so anything that denies its Christian ness in their very narrow idea of what that means is a threat to the special nature of our country. And so they have a nationalistic view on how the country should be, and it's very clear on who should run this country and who should be included as an American, who should not. My understanding of patriotism is that everyone is here and has rights to freedom and full dignity under the law, completely. And there is not a hierarchy. And so I claim the right of being a patriot. I do not consider myself a nationalist.
One of the things that we're seeing is that even though we're using the phrase Christian nationalism, similar movements are all over the world. And it's in every religious tradition. We've got Hindu nationalism in India. Putin in Russia wraps himself in the language of Russian Orthodoxy. We're seeing it in Israel right now. We see it in Hungary under Viktor Orban. And I don't think it's an accident that this is happening lots of places. And one of the challenges is, I think, the people that adhere to this movement in the United States are also looking at these other movements around the world and not only getting inspiration, but getting ideas on how they can more effectively move their program forward here. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think this is really important. I can't say that I'm an expert in it, but I do believe that exactly what you're identifying is that we're seeing this phenomenon in other places where people, I don't know if that's me doing that, but we're recognizing the power of religion to support their goals, their nationalistic goals in other countries. So this is not unique to Christianity. It is, and it's again, it's an identifier of who is a part of the country. People are very kind of threatened by the global movements of populations. That's one thing that this, that immigration or refugee status, people double down on who is really part of it, who is really part of this country, and who is essential. What is the essential characteristic of this nation? And I do think that people are looking around, and it's very odd to see a great deal of our population who are openly in support of Putin when our nation is openly resisting Putin's invasion to the Ukraine. So we do see like kind of people making common cause. I would just encourage, especially in places like America, where we actually were founded, and India this way too, we were founded explicitly not to be a nation that has a religious identity, but to be a nation that welcomed people of all backgrounds, with the non-establishment clause. That's very clear in the First Amendment. And so I think that this is religion is a motivating factor. Religion gives a sense of belonging. Religion gives a sense of common language. And unfortunately, the people who are, a lot of the people, for instance, if we talk about India, the people who are most dismayed at the Hindu nationalism are Hindus, who actually say, no, I mean, Gandhi actually created a country where Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs would live, and Christians would live side by side. So as in this country and as in other countries, there are, it's not just that there are religious identities, but there are specific strains within those religions that are leaning into this nationalistic temptation, and it's largely about power.
One more question, then we'll open it up to everybody. I at one point in my life, studied law. Sorry about that.
No, that's like a high.
Right.
That's a high form of engagement.
And so the First Amendment and the non-establishment clause has always been really important to me, and the separation of church and state. There's a really great article in this week's Atlantic by a guy named Bill McKibben, who's an environmentalist and also a Methodist layperson. And the title of his article is A Christian's Response to Christian Nationalism. If you haven't seen it, look it up online. It's really great. But one of the points he makes is that for the vast majority of Americans, this idea of separation of church and state is still a very valuable idea and a sense of our identity as Americans. And I feel that viscerally as well. Talk a little bit about, and this is kind of ironic, because separation of church and state is actually what guarantees religious conservatives the ability to worship the way they want to.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, this week, sorry, I think
we're going to get you some help.
Am I
here.
doing this? I'm doing it wrong. Can I get a mic? Yeah, I think I'd do better with that. For some reason, my face isn't friendly. Your face is friendly. This mic does not like my face.
I've always had a friendly face.
You have a friendly face, and I have an
Right.
unfriendly face, apparently. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me see if I can do better. All
Okay.
right. This week there was the beacon of all things dumb, and that's not fair. But the Texas legislature, which is not like, is a bit of a bummer, they are insisting on putting the 10 Commandments in public schools. And so my response, I put out a statement about this, not only from the legal perspective. I'm a Baptist minister and I have kids. My question to religious people is, why would you outsource your religious training to someone you have no idea what they're going to say about these 10 Commandments? You're basically, it's what we talk about religion, how we train people about religion is something that's really important and should be kept with the family and the pastor or rabbi or imam or whatever, or not, if people don't want to talk about religion. That should be everybody's right. That's the reason the case of the I think it's called the Kennedy case, of the coach who was praying with his students was so terrible. It's like that, what about the students' rights not to be forced to pray after every game? Like, whose rights are we talking about? That's the reason when we talk about religious freedom, whose religion, whose freedom? And the separation of church and state in some ways allows that to be clear, that people have the freedom to believe what they want to believe, but they don't, but other people have freedom to believe what they want to believe too, and someone in a position of power, which a teacher or a coach automatically is, it just shouldn't be allowed. And so sorry, rant. But but your point, about like, of course, like, okay, if you want teachers to be able to explain the 10 Commandments, well, there's a lot of, you could have a Marxist understanding of the 10 Commandments. And so if you're an evangelical, careful what you wish for. You know what I mean? Like, so I do think like keeping it separate. The separation of church and state is why we have thriving religion, or have for over 200 years.
Right.
And why Europe has much less religion, because they had state religions. And that's like, it's just such an important concept for religion. And people forget it was to protecting religion.
Exactly.
As well as the state.
Right.
And so like, it's just like, the irony of all of it is a big bummer. And as a Baptist, and you hear the Southern Baptists as if they don't have any understanding of their own history. We have an icon here today, which is Dr. Molly Marshall, who better than anyone can talk about the ridiculousn's of the Southern Baptist Convention. And this is, honestly, literally an icon, someone who's been through it and come out strong, but who's been through things, the Southern Baptist Convention and its turn towards fundamentalism has just been a terrible advent for American Christianity, and totally counter to this idea of freedom of soul, his soul freedom, and this idea of separation of church and state that was really part of the origin story of Baptists in this country. So I acknowledge you. I am so appreciative of you being here today, and really, feel like, the good news is that nothing is solid. We are always transforming. Religion in America is organic. So but nothing is assured. The moral arc of the universe will bend towards justice if we make sure it does. Right. And I just encourage us to be vigilant, to be engaged, and to do our part in whatever that part that is.
Okay, Phil, let's open it up to the congregation. We've got lots of smart people out there.
Yes, Ann Lewis gets the privilege of the first question.
Well, I have to say, this may be the dumbest thing I've ever done when you mentioned that. And I'm thinking Rosa Parks, and I'm thinking, okay, but I have to ask you, what do we do with our supremacist language? Can you give us a tool of interpretation? Because we do have only way kinds of language. Marcus Borg has given us a term, love language, language of enthusiasm, but I can't not say that. We have a grand commission
Right.
that can be interpreted in multiple different ways.
I don't think it's, I want to respect the claims of different religions and not insist that we have to, we should be bold about the claims we make about Jesus and celebrate it. And, it's terribly like 70s of me, but they shall know we are Christians by our love. Let's do it. And let's make people want to be Christians because they see, oh, wow, look at that. I want to be a part of that. I think it's okay. I cringe sometimes at our language, absolutely. We also, frankly, let hymns say a lot of stuff that we wouldn't say from the pulpit. But anyway, but I also want to make sure that we don't have to, that every faith that's part of the interfaith movement or shows up doesn't feel like they have to negate claims that they're making. I mean, Buddhists claim that it's all illusion, and they make claims, and they're not apologetic about it. They're very clear about it. And we could say, actually, Jesus, we feel like Jesus, whatever you guys, all of us would say something different. I might say Jesus was the full manifestation of the divine embodied in a human. It's the way I understand how to be in the world because Jesus gave me the way. Doesn't mean everybody has to follow the way of Jesus, but for me, that's the way I want to do it. If I didn't want to do it, I wouldn't do it. I'd go do something else. So I think it's okay to say why we're doing what we're doing. It might sound like a supremacy claim, but that's only when we point at people and say, sinner, as opposed to listening for what their claims are, that are also really interesting and beautiful. And we can learn from them. And it doesn't mean we have to give up one thing that we believe, except for to expand our idea and say, oh, isn't that wonderful? You do that. And I'm going to do this. And we're going to come together. And we're going to we're going to make sure that no one's hungry in our community based on each of our claims about what matters to the divine. And that's fine. I think where supremacy is a problem is when it joins with power and insists that the nation has to represent that supremacy claim. I'm more concerned about the way political people use claims of supremacy in order to create a hierarchy that is reflected in the government and in our laws. And so figuring out that feels important. But I appreciate the question, Ann. I think it's really important. We should be reflecting on the way we talk about it. But we also should be joyful that we have a tradition that gives us life. And we should feel free to say why it gives us life without saying you have to believe that too. I mean, that's my kind of way of doing that. And I've preached on a lot of those difficult tests, and I think that we can find the beauty within them without saying, and that's why everybody else is going to hell. I mean, honestly, that's where I kind of say, that's the part where I'm just like, oh, come on, we don't know what's going to happen after we die. I mean, you can say it, but and my big line, because I'm from an interfaith family, is if my Jewish cousins aren't there, I don't want to go to heaven with them. So that's just we all have to figure out this for ourselves and be bold about it. But I understand the question.
We have another question back here.
Hi, I'm Margie, and I want to talk about diversity and fear. I can remember going to a diversity workshop I got at a museum, and I was kind of popular because I was one of the few people that was a different race, so people were kind of coming over to me. But anyway, I met this lady and she said she's from a small town in Minnesota, and growing up, she didn't have any diversity in that little town. And some of the older people, that are in Dick's family, they grew up with fear of the other because, they were ignorant of what the other is, or they were just afraid. So how can we handle something like that in our church?
Thanks for the question. I do think that curiosity, like the practical implications of curiosity and being really like open to something that's not you, is something that needs to be instilled as a value of every institution, whether it's a school, a church, or other civic spaces. And, you know, I mean, my sense is that there's often more diversity in locations that people are even aware of. But they're not like, they're meeting with the people they're meeting with, and I can say from my own experience growing up in Madison, Wisconsin, there was much more diversity in Madison than I was actually engaging. Because my parents were good people and everybody was a good person, but it wasn't like viewed as important to engage the other and to have opportunities. They actually did a lot of that work. It just did, I think valuing diversity not as a slogan, but as a way of making life richer and making life more like beautiful and exciting. I mean, I do think that there's ways of introducing it into all sorts of culture, like by that I mean like corporations, higher education, all that, as a part of just enrichment, rather than an assignment. and I think that people, there is right now. I mean, God, why wouldn't we be fearful? I'm just talking about like, you have a black teenager who goes up to the wrong door and someone shoots them. I mean, like there's a lot of, and that's, the guy was fearful, but he has a gun. And, I know I'm like, this is like a tangent, but I just feel like we have to create opportunities and figure out, ways to do that is filled with joy, filled with like, exploration, curiosity, and less of an assignment.
Thank you. I'm Blanton Bessinger and been a member here for a little over 50 years. I'm one of those Southern Baptists you talked about for the first 30 years. And I have an uncle who was a Baptist preacher, and Louis D. Newton, and they're turning over in their grave with what's going on in the Baptist church now. But the point I wanted to make, and I don't know that I really have a question, but the word civil has been totally left out of this discussion. In our country, from my perspective, was founded on civil principles. In other words, you can do most anything you want to if it doesn't touch my nose or somebody else's nose or whatever. And because we'll never get there with religious views being what we based our government on. And that, to me, what the founding fathers, we were almost freedom from religion than freedom of religion. And the nationalists are using this free speech freedom, they're using this freedom of religion to discriminate. Mm-hmm. And so this civil, you can't discriminate if you believe in civility toward people. Thank you.
Okay, we...
Preach.
Go ahead. Yeah.
You should have been a Southern Baptist preacher.
That's right.
Yeah. Right.
Thank you, Blanton. That was great. Who has a question? A question. I know this hand has been up for a long time.
So thank you, Reverend Raushenbush. I want to bring up something that you talked about in the sermon that really excited me. The churches that are setting up these, in a sense, alternative educational experiences in places where you're not allowed to teach real American history, the history of African Americans, the history of gay and lesbian communities, of immigrants. I'm just thinking we're lucky here in the Twin Cities. Our schools don't have that kind of pressure yet. Hopefully we never will. But I was thinking with our denominations, how could we support churches down in Texas and Arizona and Mississippi to set up, I don't want to call them resistance schools, that's negative, but sort of truth academies. How could we set up truth academies in churches to do that exact same thing, which might again start to endear us to youth and young adults, that here is the church standing up for truth for all of us in America. That was really exciting, and I'm gonna bring it up with our presiding bishop in the Episcopal Church.
There you go.
Yeah, well, you've answered your own question. You know what I mean? Like, because one of the great things about religious traditions and religious congregations and religion is that it has networks. And so what happens in Minneapolis and St. Paul is not completely distinct from what's happening in Florida, because there's Presbyterians in Florida that are doing this work. And my friend, my seminary friend, who was across the hall from me for 3 years, who's now dean, I think she might even be academic dean at Austin Seminary, which is a Presbyterian seminary in Texas. She was the one who's doing the banned book brunch. And so I think that there's ways to, if this becomes a priority, if this becomes interesting, I think that there's ways to show solidarity. I do not think that's ultimately our goal. Ultimately, our goal should be that the public schools are safe places to learn. I said this last night to McAllister students who, they were kind of like, of course they were like, well, what do you really do? I was like, listen. But one of the things I said is, like, if you can't handle reading Toni Morrison, you're not going to do very well in college. And what they're saying is, like, they can't handle reading Toni Morrison. It's like perhaps the most genius literary person we have in American history, and they can't handle reading Toni Morrison. And so I think the end result is to, I'm not going to say it, Mr. Anderson, Justice Anderson, I'm not going to say it. You try to get me to say it. But if someone is representing a viewpoint that they're banning books and they're telling that they're not allowing to learn American history, vote them out. That's as important as these networks. And resistance churches, there's a proud history of resistance churches. The Underground Railroad, where they were resistance churches. There were lots of examples of places that were countercultural, that became locations. And imagine what a young person would think if they walked by a church and, and outside said, you want to read a banned book? Come into our library. You'd be busting down the doors, and so, like, you'd also create the ire, and so I don't want to be light about that kind of thing. Like, there's real threats that come from standing up to people who have been shown to use violence. So I don't say any of this lightly, but it is an opportunity to, I think, to testify, and this may, this is not my language, but I'm going to say it anyway, to the power of Jesus to stand up for what's right. And so I just invite us to, imagine what kind of places the Spirit is inviting our congregations to be now. Not just a Christian, I often speak in other locations, so this is, but in this case, it's a language that I know and feel comfortable with.
Hi, I'm Kate. I'm Unitarian. Yay. So I wanted to come here today so I could walk out with a concrete thing to do tomorrow and the next day. You've given me a lot. The banned book brunch, I really love. But the response team, I thought that was really curious. That
Say that again. I'm sorry.
The response team, like if there's a problem in a synagogue or a problem in another religious area, that you show up as a group. And do that. If you could talk a little bit more about that. And yes, there's a definite risk. And my rant, if I can say it, is anywhere the Bible shows up, give them a Quran.
I think she's referencing your allusion to if there's our attacks, for example, on
thank you.
synagogues.
Yeah. So for instance, the last place I gave a major talk was in Fresno, California, and it was at a Unitarian church, and it was part of a broader, it was part of a similar series like this. So it was really great, and I got to meet all the folks from the different religious communities, and it was just marvelous. And just last week, a local Lutheran church had all its windows broken because it had hosted an event for gay people. That community heard that message, and they immediately began to organize a response. And that's what I'm talking about. Who are the people in the Twin Cities, and are they on speed dial? That's an old term. Remember speed dial? Are they on a text chain? Let me try that one. Where it's like, did you hear what happened to the synagogue last night? We need to be there tomorrow morning to show this community that that's not what we believe in, and we will stand up and protect one another, and the Proud Boys, who left a card at this church that they broke down the window, they left their calling card. It's literally terrorism. Mm-hmm. And so it is serious. And even in a place like the Twin Cities, you're going to have this kind of vandalism. Things will be going down. And the next 18 months are going to be rough. As the election, it's a little less than 18 months now, as the election heats up. And so this is all going to get very real. And so as much as you can prepare power, that's what Interfaith Alliance is all about. It's like, how do we know one another so we can show up for one another, and we can face down those who would attack us and who would attack our democracy. That's an attack on democracy. It's not just an attack on a single church. It's an attack on our democracy. So that's what I hope you leave here with, is like a recognition that we all have a responsibility to every person in this city, no matter what they believe. And this is where I come back to the Christian supremacy. I hope your belief in Jesus inspires you to show up for the Muslims and the Jews and the atheists and everyone else in your community, because if not, I don't know what Jesus you're following. So this is why that's like the primary thing. And then when the kind of the secondary thing that's less kind of crisis oriented is meeting with one another and finding out what your different communities are going through. So an example in Washington is that our Sikh counterparts, the Sikh coalition, helped us to realize that Sikh Americans could not join the Marine Corps and still express themselves fully in the way they express their faith. Sure. And so Interfaith Alliance joined in the lawsuit. We showed up for them, and I wouldn't have known to do it unless they told me. And so part of the blessing of meeting one another is learning what's going on for those communities and being able to show up and sharing with you guys, with them what's going on with you, and kind of saying, we really need you to show up for us in this way. And that's, right now especially, and I will stop this sermon, right now especially, there is a fraying of the civic life of America. There is a fraying of our life together. And we need to do everything we can to weave it, to make sure that we're weaving it together with stronger and stronger bonds so that they can't destroy it. Because that's ultimately the game.
I just read an amazing book by Barbara Holmes, The Joy Unspeakable. And she talks about the spiritual practices of the Black church. And I was just wondering if you could speak to contemplative practices and their role in the work, the justice work that we need to do together.
I love that. I mean, people like Richard Rohr and many others have really looked at this more than I have. But I think anybody who, that's what I was trying to say and probably didn't say it clearly enough, but there's a spiritual discipline to this work. It's hard. And the contemplatives generally do the hard work of spiritual deepening so that we're prepared. And so I have to say it's not my forte. Some of us are really good at deep spiritual work. I'm really honest about the fact that that's like, I try, but I'm not like, I'm not so good. But my great-grandfather, Walter Raushenbush, who some people know still, and certainly people like John Lewis and Martin Luther King. John Lewis actually told me that he was very indebted to Raushenbush. Raushenbush was known for being, people dismiss him, he was just a communist or whatever, but actually his prayers are amazing. His prayers are where you really get where his heart was. And so when I'm at my best, I enter prayer life and it gives me strength. And I do think we see that. I mean, if you go to like William Barber or any of these things, there's the prayer and the singing and the intentional grounding in the spirit is I think what makes it successful and also joyful. So I like the idea of this work also inspiring joy and inviting joy, and as much as we can, using the spiritual tools that we have to invite joy, and as we do this hard work. So your point is, you're making a good point, and I'm just adding to your point, which is that there's a spiritual depth to this work and in fact, it invites that spiritual depth. And so, don't take a shortcut around it like I generally do, and that's when I'm at my worst. When I'm at my best, I'm spiritually prepared.
Hi, I'm Liz, and I wanted to speak to your parent heart for a minute. Pardon me. In 2020, I definitely have some PTSD remembering how that nationalism did breed fear and isolation. And as raising young children as I am, and you're reminding us to embrace the next 18 or earlier months of what's to come, how do you balance that spirit of open inquiry with also wanting to be aware and slightly protect the young spirits that are developing around us in our children?
How do we balance open inquiry with
Protecting our children.
protecting our children? I have to come back sometime to really talk about this. Technology and religion is the most under-examined thing in our culture, and it's the most important thing, and we completely ignore it. So I'm going to say that because mostly we think of TikTok as something we need to protect our children from, but it's partially because we don't actually give our children the education, the civic education that the technology requires. Our public square is as much online as it is offline, and we are totally unprepared for it. And the opportunity is to explain to young people what the internet is, where it came from, and what it's doing. But we don't have that conversation. We say, you've got to get off your phone. Instead, more interesting, so there's a parable. There's a older person going swimming, older fish swimming along, two young fish come by. The older fish says, how's the water? The two younger fish swim on and said, what the hell is water? The internet is water. It is everywhere. You can't, I'm not picking on you. I'm just saying you can't talk about TikTok without talking about every other way that the internet has changed our lives, transformed religion, transformed what it means to be a Christian. And we under-examine that. When 2 or 3 Christians are gathered online, is Christ there or not? Is a question that we don't have the answer to. And until we decide we know what that means, we're missing out. When 10 Jews are online, is that a minion? Big question. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to have community? What does authority mean online? And so when we talk about 2020, part of this is like, we haven't done any of the work because it's happened so fast. The internet has been, the founder of Google said the internet is the first thing that humanity has invented that humanity does not understand. We don't know what's happening, and we are under-examining it. And this is like, and so part of my goal with a question like that is, the internet can be amazing for inquiry. You can find out incredible things. In my pocket, I have the biggest theological library that's ever existed. And there is terrible danger in there. And militant white supremacists who are ready to, who have organized online and have exchanged manifestos and decided to kill people because they were able to be inspired by one another because of the internet. Not to mention AI. So we did an article 15 years ago, Ask Siri what Siri thinks about God. Siri at the time had the decency to say, that's a good question for a human. Not for long. This isn't a joke. Who's going to program Siri?
Yeah.
Who's going to tell Siri if homosexuality is a sin? Who's going to interpret some of the Bible passages talk about supremacy? So this is so serious. And to answer your question, sorry, you gave me an opening. To answer your question is that I think it's an opportunity for us, like, make sure that we you know, unfortunately, the people who are best at TikTok are not our friends, but there are good people on TikTok. So who do we want to create common cause with? Who are the people who are doing the internet very well? Can we influence them to help with this resistance to Christian nationalism? You know, there are good people who know how to do technology, and I'm going to say something, and then I'm going to disagree with myself. Young people are good with technology, and young people often understand it the least because they think that the technology is there for them, and it's not. It's there to make money or to control. And so just like, let's not get it twisted. So the opportunity, hopefully, with the internet long term is to begin to understand how grave this is and give sermons about it and give study guides about it, everything like that. And in the meantime, being wise as serpents and gentle as doves about technology. Because technology can go all different ways. And it is not de facto bad, it is not de facto good, and it is not something that we can wish away, which is something that people used to say to me, because my whole life as a minister has been as the technology has come online and grown, and I've had people the whole time I've been screaming about this say, oh, just like, get off the internet. That is not an option anymore, people, and it's going to become less and less of an option going forward.
Let us focus the question a little more for you.
Just to clarify, I actually am very widely present online as a humanitarian folk artist, and I released an album in response to it. My children are actually not online. My question was more about how do I navigate my own fear and isolation while trying to raise a child who actually just came out and is hearing very hateful rhetoric toward her own choices and her own life and personality. A more worldwide of what they're hearing, and how do I respond not with hate or fear or isolation as a parent?
Yeah, but are you talking about specifically online or just in general?
They don't have an online presence because my children are too young for that stuff.
Yeah.
So what they're hearing in the world, what they're hearing out in the streets, what they're hearing in school even, so in reality, what they're hearing.
Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, I can tell that you're probably an exemplar in this. You have your cool daughter who's here, and you have such a great vibe when we spoke earlier. Like, you should be writing the book on it. You know what I mean? Like what you're doing. I know, but so I would just like bring everything you already know. Like, like let's default towards love and interest and being, and curiosity. Let's let that be our default. And yet, like I'm really scared to put my kids online, pictures of my kids online. So like I'm trying to figure out like, I want to default towards trusting people, and I also want to recognize the world in which we live. And so there's lots of ways that we can maintain, like this is, again, it's a spiritual discipline. How do we maintain this this posture of love in the face of danger. And I think, like, again, King was preaching about love as people were trying to bomb his kids. So like, how do we? I think this is such a challenge, and yet it is like back to contemplative, back to like, what are the ways that we can not lead with fear? Because I do think that what you're saying is right. Like, I think fear leads to isolation, which leads to kind of, writing a whole population off. And that is, again, the enemy of democracy. So finding, but it doesn't, I would look very locally to start. I would also, I really intentionally follow people. I will just go to online for a second. I follow people online who I find hopeful and who give me, who expand my world. I intentionally follow people different than me, so that I can hear what they're thinking. And often that's even like much more conservative people. So who convey their ideas in a way that I think is really interesting and important. So I do invite us to be intentional about that, but perhaps the main thing is being intentional.
Okay.
I don't know who this man is, but he sometimes wants to speak. It's the judge. He wants to defend himself.
It's a burden to share the church with people like you've answered in part the question I have, but I'm an older person, and quite frankly, I'm dismayed and often ashamed that my generation is a part of the Christian nationalist movement. But I work a lot with young people, and I find that so many of them get it. They really do get it. And I think the Republicans are understanding that, because in their latest meeting they tried to figure out ways to curtail the youth vote. But what I want to know is from you is, how can we encourage this younger generation that gets it to take back our society?
I love that question, and I think I mentioned this. But I have a radio show, and I ask people at the end of every show what gives them hope. And something that 75% of them immediately say the young people. Mm-hmm. They say the young people. That the young people give them hope because they see they see an aware and engaged community. And I think one of the exciting things about, my role at my own organization and all of us in our lives is figuring out, how do we resource and inspire and give space to young leadership that can help us understand, that can inform us, and also lets them really begin to assume a rightful role in this democracy. So I would just, you're a mentor, and so you know what that is. There's also just, this church could be very intentional about housing, young organizers and giving them space. I'm not saying you should do anything, but I'm just saying that there's ways that we can use what we have to inspire new activists, new organizers, new religious leaders. I mean, wouldn't it be great? If people are like, wow, I went, when I was 22, this Presbyterian church that I'd never heard of invited a group of us to this place called House of Hope, and said we could use that space to organize our Earth Day response, or environmental, whatever, and then I started going to service, and then I actually was like, am I supposed to be a minister? Like, that's like I would love for that to be, but that's actually, a lot of the times that's the way it happens. Is like, I got invited to church when I moved to New York, and I was like, why are you doing? But I went, and then I was like, oh, this place is talking about things I really care about. And this was Judson Church in New York City. And Judson Church was this was in the height of the AIDS epidemic, and it was like organizing with ACT UP and organizing and doing all this stuff. And I was like, wait a second. And then someone said, well, maybe you should be a minister. I was like, are you crazy? But they sent me up to seminary, and then I was like, and this is the truth. This is the most embarrassing truth I'm going to say. In the chapel, they sang, I said it earlier, they'll know we are Christians by our love, and I started crying. Can you stand it? It's the most sappy thing. But then I was like, and then I went and I stopped in the hall of Union Seminary. I said, oh my God, I'm supposed to go to seminary. So I just invite us to figure out ways to unsuspecting additions to our world, who, especially younger people who might actually be future leaders.
I think this will be our last question.
Oh, good. I better make it good, huh?
Yeah.
My name's Gus. I'm a little confused. My phone, talk about technology, told me that the word love is in the Quran over 200 times. And I'm sure the fundamentalists must read that Corinthian thing that we read today. And, where's the love? I don't get it. Why is it so difficult? How can we spread the love is my question.
I mean, I love that we're ending on love. Maybe this is a theme, like how intentional can we be in creating spaces and places where love can thrive, or even take root and then thrive. And I actually believe that's a foundational Christian responsibility. And we can't expect other people to do it. I mean, we can hope other people will do it for us, but actually it's like one of the things, the opportunities. Some of the most deep love I've experienced have been with my Muslim colleagues, with my Jewish colleagues, with my Hindu. I mean, I've had such a blessed life. Really, because I've been in places and spaces where love between people who are very different was allowed to thrive. And so, it's like, it's like the earth. We can plant seeds and we can nurture it and we can make sure it's protected, this love between one another, between diverse places, between diverse people. Or we can recognize that there are lots of forces that are trying to destroy it. And so I think this is the challenge of our time, and this is the invitation that I would suggest that is before us.
Let's thank Paul for being here. Thanks for coming. Well done.